Hello and welcome to Gardening at 58 North. So in this video I'm going to show you how to take cuttings from willow. So I'm going to show you two techniques. The first one is just to show you how easy it can be to take willow, and it is probably the easiest plant in the world to take cuttings from. In the second part of the video I'll take cuttings, but I'll go into a lot more depth and using the absolute best technique to get the best results. So these are willow obelisks here that I just put in the ground last year, not intending to plant, and they've all resprouted. These are the original willows along the side here. You can see growing up. So all you need to do is find a branch, ideally a young one, just cut it off. You want about a foot or so. Once you have your willow branch that's about a foot or so, just push it into the ground. And that's literally all you need to do to take a willow cutting. It's that quick and easy. Any willow stick, put it in the ground, you're probably going to have a more than 50% chance of it rooting and growing into a tree. That is literally how easy it is to grow willow. But I'm now going to go into a lot more detail so you can get the best results. Although this works absolutely fine, if you do the best technique, then the plant's going to grow much faster. You're going to get close to 100% success rate. Whereas if you just did this, you'll probably get just over 50% success rate, but the growth might be a bit slow, and you're going to have gaps if you're going to be planting out a row. So I'll go into more detail now about what you're looking for. So when it comes to cutting willow cuttings, what you want is the last year's growth, and the most important thing is the time of year. So the technique I showed you earlier, that will only really work in winter when it's dormant. You can maybe get away with it in summer if you're in a very wet location, but generally they have to have no leaves whatsoever. So anytime the leaves aren't on the trees, that's perfect. Normally around October, November time to about February, March, depending where you are in the world, depends when they're going to be in leaf. But you're looking for last year's growth. And basically last year's growth will be the growth right at the end of the branches. Now if you've had willow that's been pruned in the past or pollarded, that last year's growth could be very, very long. So this one, for example, these trees were actually cut down this time last year down to this level down here, and now they've actually grown 4 meters in height. So any of those branches will do for cuttings and they'll be perfectly good. You can also use growth that's 3 or 4 years old. It will still root, but you'll get the best rooting success if it's only 1 year old. So with a plant this big, you can tell it's last year's growth because there's not many side branches or none at all. And so the whole lot of this can be cut into about 10 different sections. They can all be used as cuttings, the top and the bottom. But when it comes to most willow trees that haven't been pruned, it might be a bit harder to tell what's last year's growth. So to find last year's growth, just find the tip of a branch, and as long as there's no branches on that, that should be last year's growth. Where it reaches another branch, that main branch will probably be a 2-year-old growth, whereas this will be 1-year-old growth. So when it comes to willow cuttings, you also want to look at the width of the branch. If you go for the very thin branches, such as this here, about the thickness of a pencil or thinner, it's going to be very hard to push that into the soil. Also, it's very thin, it will dry out quickly, there's not a lot of nutrients stored in that. You want some thicker branches ideally. Thicker the better, but always making sure it's last year's growth and not too much older. So this is a perfect example here. This is actually only 1 year old, this growth here, and it's a nice thickness, about the thickness of a finger or a thick crayon. That's perfect. So you just want to cut it off. Doesn't matter too much where it is. You don't have to worry about internodes or anything like that with the willow. You just give it a cut. Now once you've made your cut, it's a good idea to angle it. There's two reasons for this. Firstly is so you don't forget which way is up and which way is down. If you plant a willow cutting upside down, it's almost guaranteed not to work, so you do need to make sure it's the right way around. And the other reason is it will make it a lot easier to push it into the ground. So if you've got a slight curve, such as this one here, cut it off, and so you've got a straight section. Straight sections will just make it easier to put it into the soil. Curved sections will still root no problem, but you might have a difficulty putting it in the soil. You might need to use a spade or a trowel. So this is what I'm going to be using as the bottom. So I'm just going to do an angled cut. That'll make it easier to go in the ground, and I can remember which is the cut. Now, when it comes to the length of the cuttings, it doesn't matter too much, but ideally you want to have over half of the cutting underground. But you can get away, if you've got at least a foot of it underground, the cutting can be almost as tall as you want. I've planted stakes that are about 2 or 3 meters in height, and they've grown. These ones, for example, some of these were reaching 2 meters in height, and there was almost 100% growth rate in these. These weren't planted as cuttings, so these weren't put in the soil straight away, which is something else you need to bear in mind. The sooner you put it in the ground, the better. But these were put in the ground a month after they were cut. They still rooted with no problems. So try and make sure you have fresh material. You don't want it sitting around and drying out. And although you can do it any time in the dormant period, the best time for it would probably be late winter. If you do it in early autumn, the problem is it's a long time before it starts to root. The temperature will be quite cold. There's a chance it could dry out. And if you do it in early spring, there's a chance that the temperatures get too warm and it dries out before it roots. But if you do it in late winter, very, very early spring possibly, then what will happen is I'll have it not high enough temperature for it to root, but not too high for it to dry out. So going back to the cutting, I normally try and do about 1.5 foot, so about 45 centimeters, something like that. That seems to be a good length. But as I say, if you can get this foot into the ground, you can have 2 meter long high cuttings if you want. Now when it comes to the shortest cuttings, I probably wouldn't go for much shorter than about 10 centimeters, 10-15 centimeters. When it gets that short, unless you're doing it in bare ground where there's no grass, it will struggle to outcompete with weeds. So ideally a slightly longer cut. So for this one, for example, it doesn't matter again with internodes too much where you prune it. If you want to be really precise, it is good just to do it above a little shoot such as this here. But again, it's really not fussy with willow. It'll grow wherever you do it. And just give it a nice straight cut. That way you can remember what's the top of the plant. So then you should have your cutting. It's just a matter of finding a good place for it. Willow isn't too fussy as long as it's not very dry soil. Ideally, if you want the absolute best growth for your willow, put it in a boggy area. Not anywhere that gets standing water in it. It can handle standing water, but it won't grow its best. You want to plant this somewhere that has permanently wet soil. So maybe you dig down a foot and you find water starting to collect. That would be an ideal place for it, but they can survive periods of drought, but they'll grow much better in boggy soil. So if you plant them in grass, you won't get as good a success rate. You can just push this in, as you can see, like that, and that will grow away. But the issue is the grass takes this huge amount of nutrients out from the soil, and also a lot of water. So the roots from the new willow are going to be competing with the grass. The willow will probably grow, but it will only grow probably about double the height it was originally. It won't put a huge amount of growth on. So what you really want to do is put it somewhere where there's not grass. Either remove the grass, or if you do plant it in a grassy area, put some kind of mulch down, either organic mulch or some plastic, something to just smother off the grass and have at least a foot or 40 centimeters in space around it where there's no grass. That way there's not any competition. Your willow will grow much better for it. So I'll give an example of how well these have grown. These weren't planted as cuttings. These were actually markers for my vegetable plot. This plant is this stake was originally this high here, so it's only about 20 centimeters in height, and it was planted a month after it was harvested from the tree, so it was slightly dried out. But because this was in rich garden soil and there wasn't many weeds apart from a few vegetable plants, you can see this grew about probably 8 or 9 times its height. And there was another one over here which did even better, which I've actually taken a few shoots off. This was a similar height, but you can see it's actually grown about 1.5 meters, so maybe 5 foot or so in height. You can see it was about 1 foot tall originally, and I've actually cut off the largest shoot, which is that one there. So if you have very good conditions, they can grow very fast, and even a 1 foot high cutting can grow to the height of 2 meters in its first year. But if you don't give it the perfect conditions, it will probably only grow about 1 foot in height. So when you do find the perfect spot, if you have very stony soil, you will have to dig a hole for it. If you have very sandy soil like me without any stones, you can just push it in by hand. Push it pretty much as deep as you can, to be honest. The further it's in the ground, the less likely it's going to dry out. As long as you've got a few shoots above the ground, and if you don't have weeds, you don't have to worry about the weeds growing over the top of it, you can push this right down. So it's only got 10 centimeters and a couple of shoots coming out the top, and that'll be absolutely fine. The deeper you have it in the ground, if it does dry out, there's going to be less chance of it dying from drought because it's got its roots nice and deep, so it won't dry out and die because of that. Also, there's a much bigger surface area for it to grow roots, so it'll get a much better established root system, and it shouldn't fall over in its first year. If it's planted very shallow with the new fresh roots, there is a chance that it could get blown over if you're not careful. So once it's in the ground, what you need to do is keep it well watered. As I said before, willow does grow pretty much anywhere, and you can probably just leave it and it will survive. But ideally, if you want to have the absolute best growth and get maybe 2 meters or more, 6 foot or more growth in 1 year from a small cutting like this, what you need to do is keep it very well watered, especially when it's first growing its leaves and its shoots. So this won't need much water until it starts to grow. Just need to make sure the ground is damp. As soon as it starts to grow, keep it well watered, never let the soil dry out. And you could also put some slow release organic fertilizer around, or manure, just making sure it doesn't touch the stem. That will just give it extra feed, and that will allow it to grow really fast. And then eventually, after a few years, once you got it well established, you can easily get 4 to 5 meters of growth in 1 year. So these, for example, we cut them down every year to about 1 meter in height, and then it can easily grow 5 meters and give us a huge amount of canes for wigwams or for P supports and things like that. That's pretty much it on how to plant willow cuttings. It's the same for all willows really. These are the kind of biomass willows that grow extra fast. You can do it with contorted willow or lots of different types of willow. They'll just grow slightly slower. Depends on the variety. If you've got a hybrid willow, you might even get more than 3 or 4 meters a year. But any willow will work. You can also do this with poplar trees as well. They don't work quite as well, but they're almost as easy as willow. But basically, just stick it in the ground. As long as it's planted in the dormant season, you've got over 50% chance of growth. If you do it with the exact techniques that I just mentioned, you should be able to get over 2 meters of growth in the first year.